Hello, everybody, and welcome back to those of you that have joined us in previous conversations, and to those of you who are new to these inclusive innovation conversations, welcome and thank you for joining us. My name's Fiona Murray. I'm the Associate Dean for Innovation and Inclusion at MIT Sloan, and I'm joined in that essential and really important work by my friend and colleague, Professor Ray Reagans, who's Associate Dean for DEI. We really appreciate you joining us at the Sloan School of Management as we continue our action-oriented conversations on building an inclusive innovation economy. And the person who is the inspiration behind and the leader of these conversations is my good friend and colleague, Malia Lazu, who has been kind enough to join us at MIT Sloan as a lecturer and is really leading our discussions and helping us as we really think about how to focus on the innovation economy and how we can actually take action towards having the kinds of change that we know is so essentially important to our local community here in Greater Boston, to the United States, and much more globally. You know, our focus at MIT is on innovation, and our location here in Kendall Square is in one of the greatest innovation ecosystems in the world. So we really want to focus and think about our learning journey, about the forces shaping those innovation ecosystems and shaping the innovation economy. Our history of these economies has often been one that is has driven tremendous growth, but that growth has often been subject to great inequity and inequality. So much of our work as we think about how to move on from the current health crisis and the economic crisis that we find ourselves in is to think about how we build back in a way that is more equitable. We've talked to entrepreneurs about their point of view. We've talked about finance. We've looked at this problem from a number of different perspectives. But today, you know, our perspective is very much from policy making, not just sort of grand policies at a national or even state level, but also the policies that our organizations ought to have to really drive the change that we know is extremely important. So with that, I want to hand over to, as I say, my friend and colleague, Malia. Malia is the founder of Urban Labs. She spent time in banking, focused on expanding access to capital to Black and brown entrepreneurs. She's a long-time community organizer and still has that very much in her DNA and how she helps us think about things and how she works on things. She worked with Harry Belafonte, among others, in this incredibly important work. Malia, you have brought tremendously interesting people into our conversations, people we haven't had a chance to talk to before. And so I hope I can hand over to you and ask you to welcome our guests for today, because I'm really excited to hear from them and to be part of this conversation with you. Malia, thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, and hello, everyone. I'm really excited about this conversation today as well. I feel like we've been going on this journey together for several months now, and full disclosure, you know, you're hearing from two people who I have been working with in the streets for years, and you know, and just completely respect the work that they're doing as organizers. So I'm really excited that you're going to be able to hear from them today as we focus on the role of government and in policy, ensuring that Black and brown people are no longer excluded from economies. So we're hearing today first from civil rights leader and organizer Rashad Robinson, who is the president of Color of Change and is leading a leading racial justice organization driven by more than 7.2 million members who are building power for the Black communities. Color of Change uses innovative strategies to bring about systemic change in the industries that affect Black people's lives: Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Hollywood, Washington, corporate boardrooms, local prosecutors' offices, and state capitals. Under Rashad's leadership, Color of Change designs and implements winning strategies for racial justice, among them forcing corporations to stop supporting Trump initiatives and white nationalists. Welcome, Rashad. and also full disclosure, like Rashad is one of my dearest friends, and so it's like so nice to be in this professional setting, but we haven't had to kiki in a minute, so it's hard to not just kick it to kiki. And Chuck Collins, who has also been in my life and one of the first men to support me doing this work. Chuck Collins is an author and senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where he directs the program on inequality and the common good. He is also the co-founder of Wealth for, he is also, the co-founder for Wealth for Common Good, and is an expert in economic inequality in the U.S. Chuck, welcome. It's great to have both of you. So Rashad, we're going to start with you. When we think about boycotts, when we think about holding government and corporate accountability, government and corporate accountability, Color of Change is one of the first organizations that you see on the front lines pushing for accountability. Can you help us understand why government is so important in creating equality for economies and capitalism?
So first of all, thanks, Malia. Thanks for that. And it's great to be with you, Chuck. And it's great to be with you, Fiona, and the entire MIT team. And so thanks for having me. It's helpful maybe to even say something about how Color of Change was founded, right? We were founded in the aftermath of a flood, Hurricane Katrina, which was caused by bad decision makers and turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers. Black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something, and they were left to die. And so the thing about Katrina, right, the thing that is so painful is that it illustrated things that we already knew. Geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impact of what we've done to our planet, the ways in which structural racism undergirds so many of the sort of inequalities, much like COVID. COVID wasn't racist and neither was Katrina, but America. And as a result, those systems, the inequality was sort of amplified and hit communities in different ways. But at the heart of Katrina, as an organizer and activist, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. Government, corporations, and media, when institutions are not nervous about disappointing your community, it doesn't matter what kind of research report you have or what kind of facts and figures you have if you don't have the power to actually change things, if you don't have the power to force government to do things. And so to your question, right, inequality is not unfortunate like a car accident. It is unjust, right? And it is manufactured. And far too often we talk about inequality like it's unfortunate. And so we end up sending water bottles to Flint and then stopping there and not cleaning up the pipes. We end up doing service days at inner city schools instead of actually dealing with a tax policy that doesn't actually fund inner city schools. And so charitable solutions to structural problems end up happening if we don't fully understand the role and responsibility of government and the ways in which government either creates and manufactures inequality through choices and decisions that are made, or the ways in which government through choices and decisions can actually end or reduce inequality, but never seeing inequality as either inevitable or an accident. Always recognizing the choice and the role of government. Oftentimes when we are sort of facing down corporations through corporate action, it's because politically we may not have the levers to actually challenge. When we led this summer the biggest boycott, from a money perspective in American history, the boycott of Facebook, advertiser boycott, I didn't want to do that. I would have much rather Congress and the president dealt with sort of the ways in which white nationalists and target marketing and a whole set of legislation that I'm not going to bore you with has allowed for technology that should bring us into the future actually drag us into the past. But because we did not have those levers, we had to push over. The most famous boycotts that have happened have, whether it's the Montgomery bus boycott or so many others, were preludes or pivots because of government inaction. They were not in and of themselves sort of the strategy, but always focused on what we talk about at Color of Change so often is translating presence into power, right? And power is the ability to change the rules. And changing the rules is scalable, enforceable, and multiplies over time. And that is why government is so important. And that is why we have to constantly keep our eye on not mistaking maybe the presence and visibility of an issue for actually what we need, which is power.
Yeah, we can't confuse motion with progress, right? Chuck, what are your thoughts? I see you nodding.
Well, I love what Rashad said. I think part of our challenges when we talk about public policy and the role of government is so much of it is like the wiring. Rashad used the word the rules. The rules that govern our economy, tax policy, trade policy, what government spends money on or doesn't spend money on. These are all political public policy decisions that have, in the last 40 years and over the last 400 years, but over the last 40 years, have accelerated the income and wealth and opportunity gap. So I think part of it is just to understand these, it is, when we talk about structural change, we're talking about the rules that govern the economy, the wiring, how markets are wired and the like. I think the moment we're living in is, I would characterize it, the physics of inequality is compounding advantage or accelerating advantage for people at the very top, the top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1%, and compounding disadvantage and cumulative trauma at the bottom. And the more I've worked on these issues, the more I've come to appreciate the multi-generational nature of how inequality kind of builds on itself. And as we talk about public policy, and I think about how is white wealth created? I mean, I can think about my own family. I have an uncle from Ohio. In 1949, he got a 1% 35-year fixed rate farmer's home mortgage to buy a farm for whatever, $80 a month. He bought the farm. And that government subsidy, if you will, that public investment led to multi-generational changes. So I can look at cousins and others who were able to get on the wealth building train, who were able to purchase their own homes, who were able to borrow against a home to start a small business, all those sort of compounding ways in which advantage works. And then think about all the people who were barred from getting on the wealth building train, Black and brown and indigenous folks who were, in the same government subsidies did not benefit. So I think, that's partly our job, is just to sort of expose how those dynamics and rules work and how to fix them so we can grow together, grow the economy together, deal with the historic legacy of racism and discrimination in wealth building and other ways. But we have to sort of admit it came about because there were rules and the rules were tipped in a certain way.
Yes. I always think it's so important to remind people that this is how it's supposed to work. So it seems to be working just fine. And that's what makes the systems changes so important, and why folks like both of you talk about systems change and not just talk about, fixing the problem in front of our face, but actually getting to the root of the problem. And, we are now in a new government. And we're seeing, we're having conversations around new agendas and new leadership. We've all been around long enough to know, okay, cool, now we just get to fight different people. But are there policies or areas of policy that you all see as having compounding systems effect, right? So, like you mentioned, farming, right? Like land ownership, like that's a way, right? That's a policy that can really help change a lot of the financial problems that we see, right? Are there certain policies, and Rashad, we'll start with you. Are there certain policies that have a more compounding effect than others?
So I want to talk about both policies, and I want to then talk about sort of the aspect of the policy, right? And, I recently had this conversation during sort of the check-in that I got to have representing Color of Change in our constituency with Secretary Yellen. But also had this conversation on the enforcement side with the folks at DOJ and the transition, and all of this, right, for me, right, so I can go through a whole list of, what are we going to be innovating around in terms of basic income? How are we going to be sort of thinking, about sort of banking in new ways through the post office? How are we sort of, thinking about a whole set of issues, right? But the thing that's also really important about all of this is racial justice, if it's going to show up, it actually has to show up in implementation and enforcement. And part of what we end up doing is we get policies that don't have implementation and enforcement sort of connected, right? And I'm going to give an example is like the CARES Act and the money for small businesses, right? In the design of that, you know, that money going through big banks that have had a history of Black people not being able to bank with those banks, right? It's you know, sometimes we say that Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, but people should know that it's not true. Banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. And, you know, let's not put the sort of passive voice on a system which has harmed, excluded, and targeted folks. Let's put an active voice on the system and a passive voice on the people, because otherwise we get a bunch of financial literacy programs for Black people instead of actually fixing the programs and the systems which have harmed and hurt us. And so just in terms of that, the money not actually getting to the ground, that was a design thing, and putting more money on top of a system doesn't actually mean the money will ever get there in an equitable way. And so part of the sort of listing of the policies is actually having an equity and justice framework. So we design policies that achieve that, and then through those policies we have enforcement and implementation. Another example of that is, let's say we raise the minimum wage in this country, right? But we don't do it with the right level of enforcement and implementation. What we will know is that women of color will end up being susceptible to wage theft and a whole set of other things that will mean that they actually don't benefit at scale. They will be way more likely for their jobs to go into automation than other communities. And so if we're not actually building public policy that both understands what we are trying to achieve, right? If we just ban the box and we think our job is to ban the box that asks you about previous incarceration records, and we're not having a focus and a vision about actually ending job discrimination, we could ban the box and then see the studies that show up that say it actually led to more discrimination, because without the box, people are seeing a Black person show up for a job and they're just like, well, maybe they do have a record. And so because I don't have the box, I'm just going to exclude more people from sort of these jobs. And so part of what we have to do, and this once again is why in policy conversations, I always bring up the role of power, because power is incredibly important to actually creating the conditions by which we are able to get what we want and actually get it enforced. And time again, you will see communities that have power, leverage power, and use power are able to get more out of a system than those that don't. And so part of our work is not thinking that we can policy our way out of structural racism, but that, that we can policy our way out of structural racism, but that policy can be a force for good, but only if we have the power behind it to make sure that policy is achieved. Otherwise, all of the forces that have stood in the way of progress, that have profiteered off of inequality, will find other ways, because racism and inequality is sort of like water pouring over a floor with holes in it. It will always find the cracks. It will always find the place to leak through. Our job has to be about building the mechanisms, the tools to know that those leaks will happen, and that we are planning for it, building for it, and planning to find ways to overcome it.
Thank you. Chuck, what are your thoughts around how to policies that have compounding effects, or just how to get a compounding effect out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I would build on what Rashad said. You know, there's this idea of sort of in the same way that some government policies, there's an environmental review. You know, okay, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. It has to go through an environmental review. You know, we should have essentially a racial equity audit, probably a gender equity audit too, when we look at any public policy, because just as Rashad, you know, we sort of make assumptions. Okay, well, if we raise a minimum wage, that will close the racial wealth divide. Or if we abolish student debt to a certain level, that will reduce the racial wealth divide. But we actually haven't really kicked the tires and tested out how that will play out. So it's almost like you need to have sort of a racial equity oversight function. We needed it for the COVID relief and stimulus bills. We should have had a sort of racial equity oversight of how those are shaking out similarly. So that would be a start. And then I would say, I mean, I think I mentioned on the individual level, the powerful role of home ownership and home wealth building through home ownership as a way to kind of get on the wealth building train. There are some assumptions there that need to be checked, obviously, but that is historically been one of the ways in which particularly first generation entrepreneurs have been able to get on. I think there are things like wealth building accounts, individual savings accounts. We know that if they had been put in place 20, 30 years ago, they would have had a substantial impact over the decades. And then I think there's sort of and Fiona mentioned sort of, public infrastructure investments and innovation investments that, can kind of have a catalyst effect for the whole economy. Again, with that racial equity lens, assessing each one as they go and who's really benefiting and how's that shaking out. So I think I would say it's more of a process in addition to some very important policies.
Malia, can I just jump in? I think that, this focus on the idea of a system and a systems view is one that, of course, as you can imagine, accords very much with MIT's point of view, right? That these are complex systems. And I think your point that inequality is amplified in systems, it both sort of in the kind of dynamics of rich get richer and the advantaged get more advantaged and the disadvantage, that there is both an upward and a downward spiral is incredibly important. And I think in policymaking, it strikes me that it's both then thinking about points of leverage, right? Where are the points in the system? And then I think to the points that you both made, there's then the wiring of the system, which is the wiring from the sort of policy as written to the kind of enforcement, right? And so there's sort of how the system gets wired up and then whether or not we even fund enforcement and how we think about it. And Chuck, I really like your idea of the sort of the audit, or it's almost like tracing through and saying, okay, we've got this idea about a policy like the CARES Act and this sort of, support for small businesses. Let's kind of play that out through the system, through the power dynamics. Who are the people who are going to be the gatekeepers of that funding? And Rashad, I mean, you make this point that, large banks don't have a particularly good track record of that. So why would we use that way of setting ourselves up not to be effective if we actually trace funding through the wiring diagram? I don't want to belabor the engineering analogies too much, but it seems to me that this reminds us that just sprinkling a bunch of new policies into the system that's wired a particular way is something that's at some level easy to talk about, but actually isn't going to get us where we need to be. We have to think about their systemic impact. And so for me, this is a really helpful way of framing and thinking about it. It makes our job much harder, of course, but nobody ever said this was easy. So I appreciate that point of view.
But the thing is like when we think the job is easier, we actually don't achieve it, right? And so it may make the job feel like it's harder, but actually we're doing the job, because what ends up happening is what may feel like an easier task actually doesn't sort of solve the problem and leaves us right where we started. And sometimes in worse places, because we maybe have missed the place of political will or missed the openings of the political environment and have advanced something that doesn't meet the moment, that and as a result have wasted a implementation.
Yeah, we wasted a moment, haven't we? I agree.
Right.
That's a very good point.
Right. And wasted momentum and increased fatigue. I often tell my clients, like, if you're not going to do it this way, don't do it. Right? Because doing it halfway is going to cause resentment in your employees of color. White folks are going to say, well, we tried and it didn't work, right? Like it just ends up being, and so it's almost more important to not do it, because then you're not, checking off the box. And that really leads me to my next question for both of you, which is, and Rashad, you were touching a little bit on this, I think, and talking about the teeth, right? One of my mantras is Peter Drucker's quote, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Every day. And when I first read that quote, I was transitioning out of working for Harry and actually coming into MIT. And I read that quote and I cried. And the reason why I cried is because I was burnt out pushing strategy in a culture that was never going to accept it. And I had burnt myself out doing it, you know? And I would love to just explore with you how a little bit more of how do we get to the wiring? How do we talk about, how do we redefine the narrative so that we're doing more than just checking policy boxes, but that we're actually, and because if we act different, we won't even need policy, right? So how do we just, sort of change this narrative from checking boxes to our wiring having teeth?
Yeah, and so I oftentimes define narrative as the rules and norms of society, what is acceptable and what is possible. And the space between what is acceptable and what is possible is oftentimes our narrative space about what we can achieve. And we can think about a range of issues over time, whether they be economic or social issues, where something is, there's a floor and there's a ceiling. And in that space, we can power then plays itself in. And along the way, we've changed narrative. And part of that is, and then we build power around certain narratives. Think about what you could say in the workplace about LGBT people 15 years ago that you couldn't, right? That's narrative power, right? There was a new set of rules and norms of society, what's acceptable and what's possible. And so when we think about sort of narrative, it's important to sort of recognize that narrative is not static, right? Like our opponents to what we want are pushing theirs. It's not like it's inevitable, we're just gonna win. And part of building narrative requires infrastructure, requires us to be able to engage with the vehicles that reach people at scale. And then to your point around how do we make this show up? The thing that I often say, and the thing that we oftentimes say at Color of Change, and we talked about it this morning when we had a call with folks at the White House about some of the sort of first 100 days policies that, we put on paper that we know are not just first 100-day policies, but we're aspirational, and if you don't say it, it never happens, right? Is that budgets are moral documents. They say way more about what we care about and what we believe than anything in a speech. And an example of that is like saying that you want to prosecute more corruption in the economy and less low-level drug offenses only means something if it actually shows up in the budget, because it actually costs more to prosecute corruption, because people who are doing economic corruption have lawyers, researchers, all sorts of tools at their disposal to avoid that. And so you actually have to put money in to prosecute that and have to have a different vision around enforcement. And so budgets being moral documents is incredibly important, because this is also sometimes where sort of our policy, our vision around policy doesn't meet sort of the implementation and execution that's necessary to actually make it real, is in how things are funded and how things are supported, and the evaluation on the back end, the accountability on the back end to make sure it's achieved. This all has to be worked. And then the sort of ways in which we are leveraging media and narrative to help people understand what's been delivered for them, right? If Americans like the ACA but don't like Obamacare, that becomes a problem, right? When it's the same thing. And that becomes a problem in our ability to build the right level of narrative so people have the right understanding about the role of government in their lives and the role of services that have been delivered to them. If people sort of, and that means that we have to work that in as well, because otherwise we are expecting more from voters, from people who make decisions than actually people are able to give us. And so budgets being moral documents, recognizing the role of not just narrative power, but narrative infrastructure, and being able to drive this. And I talked a little bit before about sort of active voice and passive voice on how we talk about policies, but I can't underscore this enough, right? When we call Black and brown communities vulnerable, right? We are asking questions about what's wrong with those communities, right? Vulnerability is a personal trait. You know, I may be vulnerable when I may be vulnerable like when I go on social media and I see an ex that's way too happy with his life. I'm like, that's something I need to work out for myself. That may be a conversation with my therapist or maybe with you, Malia, right? Like that is like a personal conversation. But when we call vulnerability, which is a personal trait on communities, we have people focusing on fixing those communities. And we have had, you know, years, decades upon decades, and well over decades, but decades upon decades since the Civil Rights Act, since the Voting Rights Act, of institutions trying to fix Black and Brown communities and Black and Brown families, rather than fixing the systems, the structures that have harmed and hurt us. Black and Brown people are not vulnerable. We've been targeted, attacked, exploited. Any community that has been targeted, exploited, attacked, redlined, all of those things would be suffering. And instead, we have this sort of charitable helping framework that is actually never focused on framing. What if we started out those conversations, even from a policy perspective, not thinking about helping those communities, but if we saw those communities as the protagonists in the American story? What is a protagonist but the people in a story that you root for, that you fight for, that as you're watching a movie or reading a book, sometimes your body is making movements because you see that they're facing something and you want them to achieve, you want them to get over the hump. Part of framing that isn't deficit, but is aspirational, is one that we then build policies because we're not trying to help those communities, but we recognize that investing in those communities, removing barriers for those communities will be a force multiplier for all of us. It will unlock possibilities for all of us to achieve. If we can see that and not see these issues as a zero-sum game, as my dear friend Heather McGee talks about in her new book, which folks should get, you know, we actually are going to be in a much better path, and a path that actually has power, narrative power, cultural power, political power around the issue, so that we just don't pass new policies, but that we create new contexts.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, words are so important. Fiona and I were doing a talk a few weeks ago, and the conversation was around how all these minority businesses, you know, had been discovered, and it was a surprise. And, you know, and it touched something in me as a woman of, you know, I was like, well, no, we've been here, you know, it's a surprise to you, right? But let's not call it a surprise. And, you know, it's so important that the words we use. Chuck, do you want to jump in? If not, I'm going to jump to an audience question.
Go for an audience question.
Okay, yeah. Great. So, in the chat, we have a question that asks, can you provide some specific examples of policies that have structural racism embedded in them? And of course, the first one I thought of was Black people being 3/5 of a person in the first couple of lines in the Constitution. But I know there's probably more modern day policies that also reinforce that. Does anyone want to take Chuck, do you want to take a first crack? I know Rashad has.
Go for it, Rashad, if you have a.
You know, minimum wage laws have structural from the very beginning of minimum wage, right? When it was passed as a New Deal policy, right? It excluded farm workers and excluded domestic workers. It excluded restaurant workers. Like tipping in and of itself is a remnant of slavery, and it was a way for folks to not actually be paid a fair share. But if you think about the jobs that are sort of excluded from some of the fair wage, from some of the accountability, and different states are moving on it, but those are actually rooted in structural racism. When you can exclude certain types of work that Black and brown people do, or women do, and you can make those excluded from policies, you are creating an outcome that will be experienced by communities differently, right? I could go through criminal justice and crack cocaine disparities. I could go through the fact that there's the policy on their face and there's the enforcement, right? I live in New York City, right? So you can be in Harlem or you can be a couple of blocks over, and that because Columbia University has taken over Harlem, you can basically still be in Harlem and be at Columbia University. And no one can tell me that there's not just as much drugs being done in Harlem as there is on Columbia University's campus. You can tell me and I won't believe you. But we know who's arrested, who's charged, who ends up in, and I know you're like, why are you talking about criminal justice out of a conversation around the economy? And I'm like, well, economic mobility, one of the biggest barriers to economic mobility, especially for Black and brown people, is a justice system where the United States has 4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population, and the design of a program there that keeps certain communities in a perpetual cycle of poverty by design, right? Across every single policy, structural racism exists because it is rooted in how our economy is designed. And so
That's right.
I'm not asking us to just back away and say, well, that means we can't do anything. I mean that we have to then have an equity focus. And an equity focus means that we're not just trying to undo harm, but we're trying to create systems and structures that actually move us forward. Because simply being in restoration mode and simply thinking about things from an equality framework, which is about making things equal, actually doesn't lead to the type of system change that builds equity, which is ensuring outcomes allow for the type of opportunity that is for all of us.
Definitely, definitely. Chuck, do you want to jump in on any policy thoughts around? I mean, I think about your wealth inequality and even like just the inheritance tax, which I know was something you were working on a while ago, and I think about the racism in that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like Rashad's sort of framework there, and I would just add, for instance, tax policy. Tax policy, what is it that we tax? What behaviors are taxed? What goods are taxed? Where does tax obligations fall? Why is it that we tax work and wages at higher rates than capital income? Why is it we are so much more dependent on sales tax and property taxes at the local level to fund education? All those things have kind of racial structural dimensions in terms of how we pay for the stuff that we think we all need. So that's just another lens. And I guess I would say, I think to talk about the other piece of the equation, we're living through this extraordinary updraft of wealth, of concentration of wealth and power. I call it dynastic wealth. There's 50 families in the United States that are now in their third generation of billionaires coming online. And that represents a sort of democracy distorting and market distorting concentration of wealth and power. So that's the other aspect of how inequality is disrupting our ability to build an equitable society. And all the rules that sort of encourage and fuel that divide are part of what we're up against.
Mm-hmm. Like I think, Rashad, you were saying, it's like the water we swim in, right? It's like asking a fish about the water. We have another question from the audience, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but this person is thinking about the favelas in Brazil. There's many small entrepreneurs that are not able to find any formal job but need to survive somehow. How can we create this bridge and reduce prejudice between the rich and the poor, and show the power of the ones who are not accepted in the initial system design? And I think, whether it's Brazil or the US, class run so close, in US, obviously our class is color coded as well, which is undeniable. But, can either of you speak to bridging this divide between the rich and poor? Chuck, do you want to take a first crack at that with your inequality work?
Well, I guess I would come back to that, there's a way in which the rules of the economy are making it extremely hard for people to do startup enterprises in this economy. Um, you know, uh, we sort of have this, we like to talk about entrepreneurship and people's ability to take initiative and have agency to start businesses. But there's a lot of social capital and societal wealth that sort of undergirds the people that often are able to sort of make those entrepreneurial leaps. To me, it's not a coincidence that like a society like Denmark has much higher rates of entrepreneurship than the United States per capita because they have a social safety net and because they sort of have sort of social investments that create a decency floor through which people cannot fall. So if you want to start a business, you could take that leap and not end up living in your car or whatever. It's just like this, and I think we attach all this value to entrepreneurship when you look around who has the social capital to take, leaps without a net. And yet people do it. I mean, Malia can introduce you to some of these heroic leapers, but that's not the kind of society we want. And we're losing all kinds of other people's genius when we do that. So I think, coming back to establishing, particularly in a US context, but in a global context, a decency floor in our societies of health and well-being and opportunity that enables people to just have a basic minimal security, hopefully better than that then allows people to participate in whole other ways in economic life and bring their genius and talents and ideas and entrepreneurship to the economy. So that's just one thought, another way in which extreme inequality undermines and I would argue it's in the interests of wealthy people and wealthy investors to figure out how not to keep going down this, kind of pulling apart. It's not in anyone's interest. It's not in the interest of anybody who believes in a healthy market economy to allow these inequalities to keep propelling us apart.
Mm-hmm.
Just jump in, I think, on this entrepreneurship point, which is obviously one that we think a fair amount about at MIT. And one of the questions that was kind of fed in even before we began was, the fact that some of the entrepreneurship training was framed as has not been as effective for Black and brown entrepreneurs, and how can we change it? And I think what you raised, Chuck, is a really important point, right? Which is, it's not that certain individuals are just less entrepreneurial, less receptive. In fact, I would say it's very far from that. It's what are the structural conditions under which people can be entrepreneurs, and what are the enormous structural barriers that we put in people's way to make it so incredibly difficult to take those risks when you perhaps don't have family who can sort of, even if they're not investors per se, they invest in the security that you have if things don't go well. And so I think
they have your health care, right, Fiona? They have your health care. They have your food.
So I think, for me, one of the things I think about a lot, and that I think we would like to try and shape, is, what are some of the ways in which there can be really thoughtful debates and policies around both putting into place, as you say, some of the sort of the floor, and then making access to certain kinds of capital and debt and other things just more accessible, so that people set up businesses where, when they have those insights and ideas about advantage, they're not just completely trammeled by disadvantage. And that's, I think, an important topic that we really do, want to, I think about and engage with much, much more, and understand at a grass, on the ground, what's really going on and what are the huge barriers. So I don't know, Rashad, whether you've sort of thought about some of these entrepreneurial communities. I'd be really curious just to continue this thread of conversation that Chuck sort of got us into.
Yeah. So first, I really want to associate myself with what Chuck said, because it absolutely resonated. Both in terms of sort of what are the conditions that create space for people to be able to dream and take risk, and to believe something new is possible, right? I am the product of a home of an entrepreneur. My father's been a self-employed contractor on East Long Island for nearly 50 years. And the extent that that sort of business brought my family from poor to working class to middle class, you know, is very clear to me. And middle class can mean something very different for Black families as it relates to wealth, and you know, it's all in home ownership. It's all in home ownership, you know, in many ways. But I say that to say that at every phase there are rules and barriers that exist different, that look different, right? And you know, and then you know, there's all sorts of like backstories to how that actually happens, right? If my father was a contractor on Eastern Long Island, and the 80s was a housing boom on Eastern Long Island, but that Reagan era 80s was actually very bad for a lot of Black folks in terms of jobs in other sectors, and the ripping out of labor protections and safety net, the sort of attacks on government, which was a pathway for many Black folks in terms of access and opportunities. And so it's also very important that we look at all of these things, that we have good data and have macro sort of stories to tell, so that we don't take this sort of individual, because we've gotten into a space sometimes through storytelling where we get really excited about individual stories when they actually don't paint a picture, right? It's the Oprahization of news, and Oprah has done a lot good, but the Oprahization of news can sort of take away some of the data that actually tells a story about how much something is an example or how much something is an exception. And knowing whether or not something is an example or an exception is incredibly important if we're trying to create scalable policy that impacts people's lives. And I think far too often we have been in this storytelling space, and you know, conservative forces that have wanted to drive a bootstrap analysis around whether it's entrepreneurship or risk taking or building a business, right? Have deployed that tactic in order to create a story that we all can be business owners, or that we all can be entrepreneurs. And actually, we just don't have an economy that supports that. Like, we just don't actually have a country that all of us can just start businesses and become business owners. It's just like doesn't exist. And so while we want to democratize and create more equality and equity around opportunity, we also have to recognize what the system can provide and hold, and make sure that we are at the same time policy making with that in mind.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Rashad, can I just pick up on, I think this idea of the tension between storytelling and kind of the macro facts. So one of the things that we think a lot about in our classrooms, because we quite often pair people who are entrepreneurs or people who have, you know, kind of, let me call it quote unquote, real world experience with academics, right, who presumably therefore have unreal world or otherworldly experiences. I think one of the really important things about that is that people will tell their own story. And I think the important counterpoint to that is to point out whether that is a usual, typical story or an extraordinarily unusual story. You know, the most easy one is when somebody's built their business completely alone and they'll say, you don't need anybody in your team. Well, we know that people who work in teams do considerably better. And so it's not that that person's story is wrong, it's simply very unusual. And so sort of knowing the difference between those things. I was really struck, Rashad, though, that by the fact that, and I thought it was amazing that you have I think you have a storyteller in chief in your organ. Is that, I can't remember the title. I thought it was a brilliant title.
Yeah.
And it feels like there's a quite interesting tension between needing stories because those are the inspiration. They make us feel like we are able to do something because we see somebody like us doing it. And because we have to pick from inspirational examples, not then kind of saying, oh, well, everybody can do that. And so how do we think about that? As I think you've just raised this really interesting tension in this, which I think feeds into policymaking, because policies have to be, in a sense, best designed for everybody or for the average experience.
Well, you know, I touched on this a little earlier, like different stories lead to different solutions, right? And this is like, you know, and so part of why we have a storyteller in chief is because I want to lead us to structural change, not charitable solutions. And right, so we have a whole office in Hollywood, and we are in writers' rooms for a whole set of TV shows, probably, right? This season alone, we've been in about 65 writers' rooms for major TV shows, some of which we've helped them rewrite their whole show around crime. There's some good stories out there in the Hollywood Reporter about our work, right, in crime TV shows, particularly. We worked with the Norman Lear School to look at the representation of race and the representation of crime across a season, and looked at all these shows. And right, like these shows are set in cities, right? They are showing the impact of poverty, but they are oftentimes showing it in ways that lead us to the wrong solutions, right? If for the last 20 years in this country, violent crime has basically steadily went down with some bumps here and there, but Americans, according to Pew Research, believe that violent crime is going up. There's a gap between perception and reality, a gap between perception and reality that creates these narratives, right? If most white people are going to be hurt violently by someone else who's white, but our TV shows are making white women think that the person who's going to hurt them is a black man, and then that becomes the sort of storytelling that animates our policy making, then we get policies that actually are not focused on safety and justice, but they are focused on preventing something that is not indicative of the larger sort of challenges that a society is facing. And so part of why we are in those writers' rooms, and we're part of why we can be in those writers' rooms, because I have part of why we can succeed in the back rooms is because I can get millions of people lined up at the front door. And if I didn't get millions of people lined up at the front door, I'll always lose in the back rooms. That's not just about Hollywood, that's also about Washington. It's about Wall Street. It's about all of the sort of corridors of power where you know, the system will sort of jigger itself. But the storytelling work for us is all back to sort of all the things I've been saying along the way. It's like, how do we get people to talk about systems in an active voice? How do we move folks to structural change? How do we tell stories and get stories told at a larger scale, right? If I'm only writing op-ed pieces, if I'm only going on cable news, which, you know, like the number of people it actually hits, then I'm not reaching regular people, and I'm not getting into the mental models that people have that sort of define what they believe. And this is not about simply our opponents. This is about the conversations I will have in my barbershop, where people will have notions about equity and opportunity and what's fair and how things work, that is informed by the stories that get told and the stories that have money and resources behind them. We don't disrupt that. We end up battling forces that are way more powerful and have way more reach than we do. And so I invest a lot of resources in it. I come from leading this work in the LGBT movement between 2005 and 2011 at GLAAD, where I was the head of programs and really drove a lot of the changes in Hollywood writers' rooms around the representation. I mean, the storytelling that really shaped some of the fights around helping people see hospital visitation stories in writers' rooms, see trans characters in new ways, maybe when they didn't have those folks in their lives. That has to be part of it. And, you know, we're going to be working on a report or sort of putting the sort of RFP together now to really look at some of the intersections between storytelling on TV, the intersection between Black pain and Black joy, right? Black pain being sort of one of the predominant vehicles by which our stories get told, but Black joy not being the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration, not just what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for. And Black joy being one of the sort of clearest drivers towards economic prosperity in this country, from culture to food, to so many of the ways in which we start businesses, to just like putting characters on the streets of TV shows where maybe in the background you see Black kids laughing on a playground, that sort of creates empathy and humanity in different ways. And then another report that we're working on right now around some of the economic narratives that happen, right? If Hollywood is saying that Black Lives Matter, I need to then be in the room to make sure that they know how to make them matter. How they just don't give speeches about politicians on a award stage, but they recognize that the stories they tell create the demand for those type of politicians, and they have a power to disrupt that, not just through what they say, but through what they actually do.
Absolutely. Helping people get there is something that, you know, is important for us to give people roadmaps, right? To get them from intention to impact. I often say that we're Sherpas, just trying to guide white folks in power from being well-intentioned white people to be impactful white people in this space. You know, we're coming to a close, and I just wanted to quickly hear from both of you around how we at MIT should be thinking about our role and our work, you know, and how and what we can do from our position. Chuck, why don't we start with you, and then we'll jump to Rashad.
Sure, and if I could just pick up, I love this conversation that Fiona and Rashad started talking about in terms of narrative. You know, I sometimes, and I think this is relevant, I think part of the challenge is the powerful default narrative that justifies inequality and the racial wealth divide is, if it was on a bumper sticker, it would be, everyone is where they deserve to be. Everyone is where they deserve to be. Those who have fabulous wealth and whose wealth has gone up by billions have gotten up early in the morning, worked hard, et cetera. And those who are deprived, you know, suffering from deprivation, there's something. That powerful narrative is, you know, how do we disrupt that narrative in the context of the work at the Sloan Business School? And I think, going back to what Fiona was saying, I think there's a white narrative of individual achievement and, you know, I did it alone. I can't tell you how many times over the last 25 years I've interviewed these entrepreneurs who talk about their wealth with the word I at the beginning of every phrase. I did this, and then I did this, and I did. And you sort of wonder, like, were you born in a state of nature? Were you raised by wolves? You know, did you live in a society? Is there a web? And so I think part of the work, and I would just say to people who are white like me, is to demystify, disrupt those narratives by talking about the web of supports and the multi-generational ways in which advantage works to sort of tee things up in a, you know, so when we have a discussion about who can be an entrepreneur, that we understand what was the family safety net behind somebody's ability to take the step that they took. So I think that's where the storytelling and the practical discussions about business really do come together and matter. And I would just say, I think, you know, we're at a time where there is this discussion about stakeholder capitalism, you know, that that the shareholder primacy has run its course. We're living through a period of sort of hyper extractive capitalism. What are the other systems? What does that look like to have community, worker? How do we broaden wealth ownership through employee ownership? There's so many companies now, silver hair companies, where the owners are, they're either going to sell out to some private equity fund, but they could also transition to sell to their employees. Can a business school be there to study, facilitate, enable a process of broadening wealth as opposed to concentrating it? And that should be the measure going forward. Are we broadening wealth? Are more people, are we deconcentrating wealth and power as a kind of key criteria going forward?
Thank you. Thank you. Rashad, give us our marching orders.
I want to once again associate myself with those comments. And I also just want to say that as an institution that has an opportunity to interact with, train, and engage the decision makers now and the decision makers of the future, there is so much responsibility in getting the story right so that the right set of decisions can flow from there. and helping folks understand the relationship to power that all of the things that we care about actually have, and helping far too often I end up, whether it's on Capitol Hill, whether it is in corporate boardrooms, or whether it is with people coming through my office, of people having an analysis of what could be done or should be done without a power analysis. And we can no longer train, develop, engage folks who are in the fight with us that don't have a recognition of the role of power in shaping outcomes and our need to both build it, use it, and to be respectful of it when it's opposing what we want.
Thank you.
I feel empowered, and I also feel a tremendous sense of responsibility, which I often feel, but you've brought that to the fore, but in a way that feels as if, you know, there are really things that we can do, conversations that we need to have more of, but also ways of understanding the world that I think absolutely resonate with many of the things that are deep within MIT's kind of core set of ideas and beliefs. And we just have to sort of put them together in, I think, some new ways. So I'm incredibly grateful to you for this conversation. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.